Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Gentlemen, welcome. We have three of us today. This is a very first for the Vino Veritas podcast. We're not in Plato's Cave today. We're still virtual, but there are three of us joining. It's kind of one of these cool things that being virtual makes it a little easier to do.
Hey, Dave, I want to clarify something. Plato's Cave is sort of wherever we are, wherever we convene and talk. We're helping to shed the light and move people out of Plato's Cave. So Plato's Cave kind of travels with us.
That's fair. And to that point, the whole point of when you exit Plato's Cave is to go enter the marketplace of ideas, talk with other people, engage with other people. So today we have Cody Wisniewski here with us today. Most of our podcast watchers and listeners know Cody. He's been on a few of our episodes in the past. We've all done this together a few times, but Cody, thank you again for joining us. We asked you today because you have a little bit of expertise on what our primary topic of conversation is going to need to be today, and it's just because it's once again just the focal point of the news. But before we get to that, I think first tell everybody who doesn't know you, the new people, give them a little bit of the background. And I think there's some interesting news in your life that you can share.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it. We've tipped the hand a little bit that we're probably going to be talking about gun rights or gun issues. So I'm happy to be on. Happy to be the first 3-person version of Vino Veritas. I didn't realize, so I'm certainly honored.
It's a big deal.
So I'm Cody Wisniewski. I'm a senior attorney for constitutional litigation at Firearms Policy Coalition. That big news that Dave is talking about, that title will kind of point at that for some people. So I've recently joined Firearms Policy Coalition. I am still going to be doing Second Amendment litigation across the nation, just like I did before. But we've got a new team. I've joined a new team, rather. Taking on the fight and being able to have a much larger impact across the country. So I'm really excited for the work. You can go and check us out at firearmspolicy.org to see some of the work we've already done. And you can certainly follow along and see what we'll be doing over the coming months because of a little bit of what we're here to talk about today.
Hey, Cody, do me a favor. This is like a brand new experience for me because usually I'm used to seeing, Dave's beautiful smiling face looking at me in the screen when we're remote, and my own big, pumpkin melon up there. But I'm not used to seeing your gorgeous face up here. Tell our listeners something interesting about you. I think, am I right in saying you're a whiskey guy, not a Scotch guy, but a whiskey guy, maybe a rye guy. Does that sound right?
Yeah, because I love the founders so much, right? I drink rye, which is what they drank when they fought for liberty and founded our country. So yes, I'm a big rye guy. I like to joke that I like it when my whiskey fights back. So I am certainly a big fan of that.
All right. And also, gentlemen, we have a unique, first of its kind show coming up next week. It's a little terrifying. This is like barely. Well, it's a week away. Next Thursday, July 28th, we're putting on a show in Nashville, Tennessee. Well, actually, we're in Franklin. It's just a little south of Nashville, and it's a wonderful venue. It's called the Factory at Franklin. It's big old. It actually used to be a factory. I think they made stoves there, and they've remodeled the whole thing, and there are, restaurants and bars and stores inside and several venues for live shows. And we're going to be on one of those stages. And we've got a really special guest, Dr. Ben Carson, the famous neurosurgeon. If I remember right, Ben Carson, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't Ben Carson the first surgeon to successfully separate Siamese twins conjoined at the head? And I mean, like he's not just a physician, he's a pioneering physician.
Yes.
And And then he's also dabbled in politics. I think he's run for some offices before, like president of the United States, and he was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And he's going to be with us. He's going to be up on stage with us. This is going to be the biggest event that we at the Vino and Veritas Society have put on to date. We're going to do bigger ones in the future, but to date it's the biggest thing. And so we strongly encourage. I mean, I believe we're going to have a live feed of this thing, but more importantly, is going to be the experience of just being there in person. It's going to be a great experience. It's going to be a great show. So it's not too late. You can still get some tickets. We have lots of people traveling. You might be thinking, well, Tennessee, I don't live in Tennessee. That's okay. We have a lot of people traveling. Some are traveling a long way to come to this show. Just go to our website. You can either go to our website or the web address, vinoandveritassociety.com/events. And that'll be all the information about the show, when it starts. You can get your tickets there. And it really is going to be a show. This is not some stuffy, boring academic lecture. There's going to be a lot of energy. We're going to have some vino available. We're going to have some fun drinks, and we've got a vendor there that does Tennessee themed. How do you describe it, Dave? Tennessee themed Mexican food. Does that sound right?
Tennessee themed tacos. A lot of Southern food made into tacos. I took Cody. Cody came out here to visit me while I've been down here putting this thing together. Cody came out and visited and for the 4th of July, actually. And I took Cody over to Mojo's Tacos, our wonderful food partner. Had a great meal, but we're talking about things like fried chicken tacos and fried avocado tacos. So here's the thing. I'm not everybody knows this about me at this point. I'm not a vegetarian type, right? Like put meat in my food. And everybody around me for 2 months now, as we've been putting this thing together, has said, you got to have the fried avocado tacos. And I'm just thinking, no. I gave in yesterday. Yeah. I gave in yesterday. I tried it. Oh my God, was it good? I didn't miss the meat for 1 second. So we're talking things like fried avocado tacos, fried chicken tacos, brisket tacos, things like that. They have a couple of vegetarian options, a couple of really solid meat options, and Cody and I both really enjoyed it. I've probably eaten there a few too many times over the last 2 months, but I'm enjoying it.
It was fantastic. That venue is so cool. The food was amazing. The dessert nearby was fantastic. Like everything was just great about it. I'm so excited. I am going to be there. I am one of the people traveling in for it. So I will be flying in from Colorado, and I cannot wait.
To that point of traveling, we've had a lot of members say, man, I wish this friend who lives in so-and-so place could actually see you speak live. They have talked about this. And the trip from the East Coast to Colorado, when we do shows in Colorado, it's a longer trip. The trip to Nashville isn't that bad. If you have friends in places like Ohio, Atlanta, Florida, New York, all along the Eastern Coast, it's really not a bad trip. And this would be a great opportunity to tell people to come on in.
Yeah. So again, if you're still interested in going, there are tickets available. Go to vinoandveritassociety.com/events. It's just our website address with /events. It'll take you to a page that has all that information, and it is going to be a rocking, great time. I really do think this show is going to put the Vino and Veritas Society in a new orbit, and it's going to be a fun thing to be a part of.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to talk about one little quick story. We like to kind of look at things that are happening that sort of show human behavior, some of the natural things that humans do, and why the back up the benefits of the Constitution, why the Constitution was so good, why the Declaration was so good, and Tom, one of your go-tos is always that incentives matter, right? And the entire idea of the Declaration of the Constitution of the American idea is based on this concept of incentives. If you incentivize people properly to be productive, you guarantee them protection of their private property, which allows them to grow. It's going to benefit them. Well, a company in Japan about 5 years ago took that message to heart. And I just saw a follow-up on this story. I saw this story back in 2017 when it first started. And it just proves the whole idea that incentives, in fact, do matter. And I wanted to throw this out before we get into a much more heavy conversation. Sure. So this company in Japan, it's a marketing agency, had an employee, a graphic designer, come into HR one day complaining, saying, I can't get anything done because too many of my coworkers are taking extended smoke breaks. And I guess in Japan, smoking is still a very, very common thing, much more so than in the United States. Okay. And taking smoke breaks throughout the day. So the company started tracking this, and they determined that the average employee was taking 6 days worth of smoke breaks over the course of a year. So they decided to incentivize people to stop taking smoke breaks, not necessarily for the health of the people, but because the graphic designer needed something approved and they were waiting an extra 20 minutes. So not only was it making the person who was taking the smoke break less productive, it was making the graphic designer less productive because they had to wait for that person as well. So they started saying, if you stop smoking and you don't take any smoke breaks, we will give you 6 days of extra vacation every year.
Wow.
Yeah. So all of a sudden, 5 years later, an article came out just a few days ago.
So wait, Dave, I have to clarify here.
Okay.
You mean the government didn't issue a regulation?
I think the government in Japan might still be handing out cigarettes, but that's just my thought.
This was just an offer, a voluntary, like if you want to do this, we'll trade you. You stop taking smoke breaks, and for that, we'll trade you 6 more days of vacation time.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Exactly right. So 5 years later, they have shown it's been working, and they didn't give specific. I tried to find specific statistics on how much it actually stopped, but they did interview all of these people and say, what have you done with your 6 extra days of vacation? And you saw all kinds of answers, right? You saw, I spent more time with my kids. I spent more time. We went on vacation. My favorite one was, I learned how to golf. Some guy said, I'm going to take those 6 days and I'm going to dedicate those 6 days to taking golf lessons for a week. Yeah. And he became a golfer, so to do something on the side.
Okay, well, that's skeptical, because anybody that has learned how to golf in 6 days must be a phenom of sorts.
I mean
that there is a little Tiger Woods in there, right? So
yeah. It's absolutely true, though, and I mean, look, we can actually, this is probably a good pivot point right into our topic. Incentives really do matter. The founders were very much aware of this, and not only in good ways, like what we're talking about with this example, but also in bad ways. If you create an enormous bureaucratic government that is incentivized to harass people or to fail, if you tell bureaucracies, hey, the way you get a bigger budget next year is to miss all your goals, fail, fall short, and then come and say, well, we could do better if we just have more money, right? Those are kind of disincentives. They're incentivizing undesirable behavior that we don't want. And it's a big key part of the whole design, the whole purpose of the Constitution, to say, okay, the founders' view of government in general was government is both necessary and highly problematic. It's a great danger. So we got to have it, but if we're going to have it, we're going to try to limit the powers of this government down to the bare essentials, what they absolutely need to exercise to protect our rights. And even then, we're going to watch them like a hawk. We're going to make sure that they don't do anything that we didn't actually empower them to do, because once they start doing a lot of things, they're going to do it wastefully. There's going to be corruption. They're going to want to take more of our money. So that was sort of the general view. Make sure they protect our rights, but don't give them too much power, because they'll start doing things like taking our money and giving it to their friends, giving it to their family members, giving it to what's Joe Biden's son, giving it to Hunter Biden. They'll use government to funnel this money, and so this is the big overarching framework of how to think about government. It's necessary. It is going to be problematic no matter what kind of government you design. It's people in there, and they're going to try to use those powers for their own interests, for their own advantage, and take advantage of others. And it only has one legitimate purpose, which is to protect our rights. And here's the other key thing about the founders. They said, of course, government should protect your rights, but it's not only the government that's protecting your rights. We should be protecting our own rights as well. Like in a way, we are our first line of defense, each of us as an individual. I should defend myself first. And then if I need some help, if I can't do it on my own, if there's someone has violated my rights and I can't go hunt him down, then government should get involved. That's what a police department is for. That's what a criminal justice department is for. But it's not to replace our natural right to protect ourselves, to defend ourselves. It's in addition to our natural rights. And that's sort of a segue into this whole big realm of guns, right? What guns are all about. It really that this whole subject flows from the basic premise of each of us wanting to protect ourselves and protect the people that we love.
To that point, there's a lot of directions we could go in this, and I think we should try to keep this somewhat in a line of thinking. I actually think there was obviously a huge story over the weekend of a shooting that we had what many are calling a good Samaritan, what others are calling an outlaw. It's been I love Cody's eye roll when I said that, but it is the reality. I mean, the gun control people are pushing back, saying we don't care that this guy saved potentially dozens of lives.
Dave, lay out what happened so that everyone's clear what the story was.
I was going to let Cody do that, but I wanted to, before we even get into that, I'd like to take a step back. Tom, you and I have talked a little bit about some of the gun rights cases that have appeared in front of the Supreme Court over the last couple of months, and some of the decisions that have come down. And I think those are important to start with. Just to lay some groundwork. And luckily, and one of the reasons we asked Cody to be involved in this is Cody was actually intimately involved in the cases that the courts have been looking at, both on state levels and on national levels. So, Cody, maybe start with that a little bit for us. Lay that out for us, your involvement, some of the cases that you think are particularly necessary to pay attention to, what the court's decisions were in terms of what we got out of that. And then we can kind of play that into how do we approach what happened more recently.
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest case that the Supreme Court decided recently is New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. This was a case that challenged New York State's carry licensing law. So New York State had a law in place that we in the industry generally call may issue, meaning if you applied for a permit in New York State, they may issue you one. And the reason it's a may and not a shall issue, like in many other states, like in Colorado, if you're listening from here, is because New York had a discretionary element in their licensing law. They had an element that an individual had to demonstrate a sufficient need to receive. Exactly. Yeah. Tom's laughing. A sufficient need to have a permit in public. And just to head off where this is going, a generalized interest in protecting yourself in public was not deemed to be a sufficient need in the eyes of New York State licensing officials. Living in an area where there's a rising crime rate, a high crime rate, increasing crime rate, that is not a sufficient need, or was not a sufficient need in the eyes of New York State licensing officials. The other interesting one that came up is being carjacked. Being carjacked does not demonstrate a sufficient need because according to New York State, that's a crime of opportunity. And you can't possibly know that you're going to be carjacked again. So why would you need one to defend against future carjackings?
All right, I have to comment on that. So some of our members know I have family from Denver and the rest of my family's from New York. And I started spending time in New York, significant amounts of time in New York, starting as a very, very little kid. And I still remember the very first day. Tom, you'll get this reference, Cody. I'm a little worried that I'm going to date myself in this, and all of a sudden I'm going to feel really old for a second. The first time, I had been begging for years as a kid for my mother to take me to FAO Schwartz. Tom, you know FAO Schwartz. Cody, I'm not sure if you have any idea. FAO Schwartz has since gone out of business.
I don't know what that is.
It was the most famous toy store in the world. Huge toy store. And there was a famous scene. What was the movie with Big?
With Tom Hanks.
With Tom Hanks, and he's in FAO Schwartz toy store. Yes.
I'm not gonna lie. I didn't know that was real. I thought maybe it was just like something for the movie.
Yeah. No, that is real. So you walk in and there's a giant, like the biggest stuffed bear you've ever seen in your life. It's like 2 stories tall. You would walk in and then you'd go upstairs, and that scene from Big is on one of those pianos that you play with your feet, where you kind of skip along on your feet and it plays the piano. So finally, after years of begging, I'm 6 years old, 7 years old, and I finally convinced my parents to take me to FAO Schwartz as a kid to go see it. And we're walking in, and that was the first time I ever witnessed a carjacking in my life. I am still traumatized to this day from watching that day. I watched a limousine driver. This is just the driver of a limousine sitting out in front of a building across the street. He wasn't doing anything. He was just sitting in his seat waiting to pick somebody up. I watched 2 guys walk up, open the door, pull him out, beat him to a pulp, and then just grab a couple things from inside the car and just walk away. They didn't take the car. They didn't want the car. They just wanted him and something that was in the car, and just walk off. And I'm a 5, 6, 7-year-old just observing this. I can tell you from that experience, you need a weapon for carjackings, 100% without a doubt.
Well, and I'm sure in New York, witnessing that also isn't sufficient to get a permit. So
before you go on, I just want to mention 2 quick things. One, the real need to carry this, it should always be sufficient to say, I live in a city that's governed by Democrats. I mean, that right there, right, should prove the need. But also, I want as listeners are thinking through what you're laying out here, I want them to think about applying that premise to any other kind of right. Like, what if someone said, well, we're not sure if you have the right to free speech. Do you really have a need to speak freely? We need you to fill out this form here and tell us why you really need to speak freely, or why you need to worship a religion freely. Like, you have to demonstrate your need here. And if it's not sufficient to us, we're not going to grant you the permit or the license to go, right? We would say that's ridiculous.
Yeah, and that's something that's been happening with firearm issues for decades. I mean, many other issues as well, but we've seen it really poignantly in firearm issues, is that the way that the court would apply the law, or the court would interpret the Constitution in other, natural rights issues, what the court characterizes as fundamental rights, which is kind of a court made up term for it's important. I thought they were all important, but it's the world we live in. They would apply a certain standard to those other rights, and then it would come to guns, and then magically that standard would kind of just go out the window. And now we would be factoring in all these extra things, and the right in and of itself, that natural right to protect yourself, which is just inherent in life, right? Your ability to protect your own life is necessary in order for you to live it. That just didn't matter. And that's really what this case changed. So that's what you have with this. Was what New York's permit system was. Now, I do think it is interesting to note some of the things that were sufficient to get New York carry permits were, there was one case where an individual bought a licensing officer breakfast for a year. That was a sufficient need in order to get a permit.
There was a certain incentive.
Yeah. There was a certain rock band whose name I won't mention that went down to the licensing office and was able to get their permits. And then magically, a limousine showed up to the licensing office later that night and brought the officials to a concert at Madison Square Garden that evening. So that was probably unrelated, I would assume, and definitely had nothing to do with permits. But that's what happens, right? When you put this government discretionary element in the way, not only are you forcing individuals to justify their need to the government, which is completely backwards, you're also giving all of that power to the licensing officer who is just human, right? And half the time, there might have been good licensing officers that, took very benign reasoning or tried to water down New York's requirements as much as they could. But for every one of those, there were 10 guys asking for free breakfast and concert tickets. Yeah. So that's
and then it gets even worse when you start getting into, hey, mayor, you owe me a favor. Hey, governor, you owe me a favor. I need you to go over here and get these 10 people permits. Go. Mm-hmm. You're going to order those licensing officers. You're going to order them to give permits because you owe me a favor and I need that done. And if you want to get reelected, if you want me to donate to your election next time to your reelection, you're going to do this. There's not a hey, if I get you concert tickets, would you be willing to? No, it's you're going to do this. And that's when we stop being, that's the stuff of oligarchy.
Yeah. Who had carry permits in the state of New York is every security guard guarding every politician, every state building, any federal offices. They all were able to carry firearms in the state, but not you, not me, not ordinary individuals. Yeah. So this case was brought essentially challenging that discretionary element. And they lost at the court below. They lost at the Second Circuit, which is the intermediate appellate court for New York, for the federal cases going through New York. And then the Supreme Court got its hands on it. And the Supreme Court did something kind of amazing here. First, this is the first major kind of landmark Second Amendment opinion that the court has issued since 2010. So there was a major decision in 2008, DC v. Heller. There was another major case in 2010, which is McDonald versus City of Chicago. DC v. Heller applied or interpreted the Second Amendment and determined that it did in fact protect the right to possess a firearm, a functional firearm, in the home for the purpose of self-defense. That's kind of the most limited potential outcome or holding of Heller. And then what McDonald did in 2010 was it said that the Second Amendment and its protections applied against the states via the 14th Amendment. And so just a really brief explanation of that. After the 14th Amendment was ratified, courts have now looked to the 14th Amendment and certain clauses within the first section of it and have used the 14th Amendment to say that the provisions of the Bill of Rights, which by their terms generally apply against the federal government, that those provisions also apply against state governments. And so in 2010, the Supreme Court said, and I know Tom probably has particular feelings about this, but this is how the Supreme Court has done it.
I'm cringing right now, but you are certainly right. This is what the courts have done.
So in 2010, the Supreme Court essentially said, yes, the Second Amendment applies against the states like New York via the 14th Amendment. And there was an opinion in 2016 that dealt with stun guns. It was a per curiam opinion, meaning that there was no official author, and it was rather short. But this is the first major one we've had since then, really, since 2010. And we've all been waiting for this in the gun rights space. It's been over a decade that we've been waiting for the court to address this. The problem has been lower courts, so district courts, which is the court that you first file a lawsuit in, like a federal district court, and circuit courts, which are the intermediate appellate court. So if you don't like what the district court said, you get to appeal to a circuit court, and those circuits cover groups of states. Those courts, since Heller, have been refusing to apply the actual test in Heller. In Heller, the court said that you have to look to the original public meaning of the Second Amendment. You have to look to what those words meant when the Second Amendment was ratified in 1791 to determine what that amendment protects. And then if there is a state law or a federal law, infringing upon or affecting those rights, the only way that that can be determined to be constitutional is if you could draw a direct line to an analogous historical regulation that was allowed at the time of ratification. The idea of that is, if the framers drafted and the states ratified the Bill of Rights, and then a law was passed the next year and no one threw up any issue with it, then the idea would be that that law was obviously constitutional because the people that passed it were the same people that ratified the document.
Right.
So that's kind of why they look to some of that historical regulation or traditional regulation around the ratification. So courts across the nation have instead been using interest balancing. They basically go, we're going to balance your need, your asserted purported need to protect yourself against the state's interest in police powers, in securing a free state, ironically, in protecting you against, from other people or from yourself even. And magically, many of the circuits that are not favorable to gun rights have, under that framework, upheld every firearm regulation that they reviewed. So even just by sheer numbers, that should be suspect.
Yeah. I want to take an opportunity here. We don't usually get way down into the constitutional weeds, but we have our friend, the practicing constitutional lawyer here. So I kind of want to dig into this just a little bit. A couple of interesting things about that history you just laid out. One, and I'm going to make a big sweeping pronouncement, and maybe some of our members will want to push back on this a little bit. The Supreme Court has done many nefarious things over the last 75, 80 years. Among them is conjuring up this argument of balancing interests. They'll say, well, the government has this significant interest in whatever it is, protecting public health, public safety, whatever it is. And so we're going to balance them. The truth is, this is my big public pronouncement, the government has no interests, period, none. What the government has are a few enumerated powers that we, the people, delegated to it. That's it. That's it. If we didn't give them a power, they don't have it at all. So I wish we could just get rid of this notion of, well, the government has these certain inherent, intrinsic interests, and we have to balance these things. Also, I wanted to mention this notion of this incorporation doctrine that you're talking about. It's really a peculiar thing, and it can be used to kind of cut both ways politically. Certainly, the history you laid out is absolutely right. The court has, in fact, gone back and said, well, through the 14th Amendment, and there's a long technical background here, they sort of gutted the privileges and immunities to clause to not mean much. And so they were searching around. Well, don't citizens have something? Doesn't it mean something? They said, well, they have the protections in the Bill of Rights. That's what they have as a citizen. So we're going to incorporate, through the 14th Amendment, we're going to apply the Bill of Rights to states. Now, on its face, in some instances, that's just ridiculous. It's impossible. Case in point, the very first sentence of the very First Amendment, right? The First Amendment is explicitly a prohibition against Congress. And it begins famously, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And doing these, they can't restrict speech and assembly and those things. But the fact that it was Congress was very deliberate and very purposeful, because they were sitting there talking in the first Congress. That's where we get the Bill of Rights. Madison is the primary author. And they were having these discussions and these debates. And they did not want an established official church at the national level. But they also realized many states at that time did have official established churches. Now, of the founding generation, many of them were saying, that's a problem. We got to get rid of those state-based established churches. But they weren't those states. Massachusetts, for example, was the last state to disestablish their church. They weren't going to ratify an amendment, right, that made what they were doing in their state unconstitutional. So the whole purpose of the First Amendment is to restrict the federal government. The federal government may not do certain things that the states may do under the original Constitution. Then to come along later and say, well, those are going to apply to the states. That makes no sense when there is a federalism component in the very design of some of those amendments. Now, so
Tom,
someone like
Can I challenge that as a devil's advocate point? Because this is both of your areas of expertise, not necessarily mine. But
Sure.
But as you're talking, I have sort of the idea processing, and I'm curious your thoughts on it. The idea I'm thinking about is how much of that was intentional, that they actually they wanted to keep that federalism component, and how much of it was, this is what we need to do in order to get this Constitution ratified, much like slavery in the Declaration, right? We know that if we tell states that you as states also cannot have a designated church, you're not going to ratify this Constitution. So therefore, in order to do so, we have to keep that federalism element to it. Does that question make sense?
Well, I don't think those are two separate things. I mean, I think it was the same thing. You had people in some of the states who they wanted to have taxpayer-supported churches. Now, a freedom guy like myself who loves private property, and I loathe the idea of a tax-funded church. No, I don't want to take money from other people by force and go fund a certain church. But they existed, and there were people in certain churches in certain states. They were not ready to just give that up. So if a Bill of Rights was floated that stopped states from doing that, it wouldn't have been ratified. Many people, many states would have pushed back. So that was central to those discussions. But they were also they were talking about these things openly, very openly about this.
But isn't that a way of justifying the 14th Amendment's application in the incorporation clause that you're talking about? The way of applying the 14th Amendment here, can't you apply it in the same way we talk about slavery, that we couldn't get slavery in the Declaration because it wouldn't have been ratified, but we at some point knew it had to be taken care of, it had to be addressed? No,
because look, the First Amendment says what it says. It means what it means, and we ratify it. Whether we think that is wise or foolish, it is part of the Constitution. And the 14th Amendment nowhere says, hey, go take select parts of the Bill of Rights and apply them very selectively in certain instances.
Fair.
Right? That's just twisting the whole meaning of the 14th Amendment. Here's the bigger point I wanted to make. So there are critics out there, constitutionalists, who will say, that whole incorporation thing, that stinks. That's not sound constitutional reasoning. The 14th Amendment should stand on its own and be applied on its own, and get rid of this incorporation stuff. So then progressives will come along and say, okay, Tom, so you don't want to apply the Second Amendment to states, huh? The Second Amendment only applies to the federal government. But here we have to look at each amendment independently. The wording of the Second Amendment is very different. Where the First Amendment specifically applies to Congress, it says Congress shall not do these things. The Second Amendment says that this right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, period. It does not say shall not be infringed by the federal government or shall not be infringed by state or county or municipal. It says shall not be infringed. And I wish they made the period even bigger, right? Period. That's it. No governments get to infringe that right. So in that sense, you don't need to incorporate the Second Amendment to apply to states. The Second Amendment, I would argue, on its face, you just read it, and it applies to every level of government. No level of government, nobody in government gets to infringe your right to be armed and defend yourself. Cody, what would you agree with that?
I think we would probably have a little bit of a disagreement about the privileges or immunities clause.
Okay.
Because I do think that the 14th Amendment, when ratified, fundamentally altered our constitutional structure. And I think part of if you look at the debates surrounding the 14th Amendment, part of the intent there was to protect certain rights for, citizens of states as well as of just the United States writ large.
Yeah.
But to your first point, I actually think what you were talking about with this interest balancing is why this Bruin case is so beautiful. And to your point, actually, your maybe not favorite, Justice Scalia in Heller actually said that this right can't be subjected to the interest balancing of courts because it was already subjected to the interest balancing of the people when that amendment was drafted, argued, and ratified. And yet that's what courts weren't following after Heller. So basically the court said, look, this has already been balanced. The die is cast, the scales have been weighed, or I guess the scales have done the weighing. I don't know that you weigh the scales themselves.
Right.
But that, and so what the court did in Bruin was kind of threefold. One, it struck down this discretionary element of New York's licensing system. It basically said, look, you can't have a discretionary element when there is a constitutionally protected right involved. That's not sufficient. Second, it said that there is, in fact, so this is, again, in constitutional law, we have to follow the pronouncements of the Supreme Court. So this is the first time in 2022, significantly over 200 years after the Bill of Rights was ratified, the court said that there is, in fact, a constitutionally protected right to bear arms outside the home. Now, I read the Second Amendment, and it says keep and bear arms. But now the Supreme Court has certified that there's a right to possess arms outside the home. So now we can have that conversation. So that was number two. But three is exactly what you're talking about, is not exactly what you're talking about in incorporation, but is exactly what you're talking about in that protection that the Second Amendment affords to individuals and how courts have to look at that. So courts have to look at the text of the Second Amendment. What does the text mean when it was ratified, and determine using kind of that historical analog. And what it is doing, really, in a sense, is it is taking that right that was balanced in 1791, that was determined by the people, that was, from the consent of the governed, and is now forcibly applying that both against the federal government and against the states via the Second Amendment. They just have a little asterisk in there that says, oh, also, by the way, via the 14th Amendment.
Let me put. I'm curious just to get your response to this. I would argue if Congress passes a law, and or if any federal regulatory agency issues a regulation that in any way restricts, limits my freedom to keep and to bear arms, which is to own firearms and to carry them with me. If they do anything, I would argue the real problem there is that we, the people, never gave the federal government that power. We never delegated that power. That problem, that's really not a Second Amendment problem. The Second Amendment offers an additional layer of protection for us. But principally, this is a question of, did we, the people, actually give that power to the federal government? I'd say no. And how we know that is we read the Constitution and we see that we, the people, never gave it. Now, if a state does something like that, if the state either passes a law or a state regulatory agency issues regulations, then the Second Amendment becomes really interesting because the U.S. Constitution does not enumerate the powers of states. There is no strict enumeration of power in the United States Constitution. So the Second Amendment becomes a much bigger subject. And I would argue one more step. Not only, the court here in this recent case in New York, they struck down the discretionary element of New York's licensing process, licensing law. I wish they had taken aim at the licensing itself and said, even to require a license of any kind, whether it's a may issue, shall issue, if they say you have to have a license and the license costs $100, and I say, well, I don't have the $100. I don't have the $100 because I just spent my $100 on a gun. I don't have the $100 for your license.
Can you show me where you got a gun for $100, Tom?
Well,
I'd really like to go shopping there.
you see my point, right? I mean, why do I have to have money to go get I have the gun, and I have the natural right to defend myself. I have the constitutional right to own it, and to bear it. So who is the state of Colorado or the state of New York or the state of California or any other state government to come and tell me I have to get a permission from them, a permit from them before I can carry it? I mean, I think that's the logical consequence, the logical reading of the Second Amendment. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. And I mean, so that's a lot to unpack. But so starting with the constitutional structure, I completely agree. We never granted the federal government, we never granted Congress the power to be able to regulate. Well, actually, let me rephrase. We never granted Congress the power to be able to prohibit what you could or could not own. We did give Congress the power to call forth the militias and to actually arm the militias. So if the federal government passed a law like handing out ARs, that would probably pass constitutional muster under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15. If anybody wants to check me, I'm pretty sure that's the calling forth the militias. So I would love to see what would happen if Congress all of a sudden passes a law being like every citizen above the age of 18 is hereby issued an AR-15 or an M16 full auto. Let's see what happens.
Right.
So that is certainly allowed, but there's nothing in the constitutional structure. There's nothing in the powers granted to Congress that allows them to restrict civilians, restrict individuals from possessing certain types of arms, any arms, the carrying of those arms. That's just, I completely agree.
I want to expand your point just a little. There's nothing there that gives power to Congress to restrict or regulate any kind of weapons at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
And people listening right now might think, oh, Kranwitter's lost his mind. He's crazy. Is he saying that citizens should be able to own a bazooka or an Apache helicopter?
I want a tank.
And I mean, whatever one thinks of me doesn't really matter. What matters is what's in the Constitution. If Congress really only has the powers that we, the people, delegated to it, there is no power to regulate or prohibit us from owning any kind of weapons at all.
Yeah, I think Biden's, famously trotted out line repeatedly of like, well, you couldn't own a cannon during the Revolutionary War is my favorite example, because you absolutely could own a cannon during the Revolutionary War. If individuals didn't own cannons, we probably would have lost the Revolutionary War because those were brought into service on almost every battlefield along the East Coast in order to bolster our forces, to bolster the Constitutional Army. Like, they brought in private cannons in order to be able to fight the British. So, yeah, I mean, it's very obvious, if not only from the constitutional structure and from the lack of any power in the Constitution, but also from that history that courts are required to look at now, that there is no provision in there that would allow Congress to do that sort of thing.
So I want to move us along a little bit, because we're coming up on our time, and I do want to get to the events of the weekend. The reason I wanted to bring up Bruen first and have you talk about Bruen is one of the big conversations about this is, should this Good Samaritan have been carrying in the first place? And what Bruen really did was be sort of that final nail that said, yeah, if he was comfortable and he was trained and he was felt like he was ready to do it, there was no reason he should not have been carrying, and Bruen confirms that. So, Cody, if you could now walk us through a little bit, if you're comfortable, what happened over the weekend and where all this will go from there.
Yeah, so there was and let me make sure I get the name right. So there was a shooting over the weekend in the Greenwood Park Mall in Indiana. And somebody brought in a rifle into the mall and started to open fire on just peaceable individuals, people that were just going about their business during the day. Obviously, a deranged individual who is seeking to inflict damage, to hurt people, and these shooters are commonly people who are seeking some level of attention. I mean, it's disgusting. But luckily, there was an individual in the mall that was concealed carrying a handgun. And as soon as the shooter opened fire, this individual drew their firearm and killed the individual the would-be mass shooter. And it really goes to show what we've been saying all along, what we've been fighting for all along, which is the only true means of defense is allowing peaceable citizens to possess the firearms that they need in order to defend themselves, their loved ones, and their communities. And that's what this guy did. He's a hero. He defended his community using his concealed carry firearm. And he took an event that could have been so much worse.
Yeah.
And was able to control it and contain it. There's no way that, I mean, let's set Uvalde aside and all of the craziness that has come out after Texas of, upwards of 400 officers standing by while the shooting was taking place, no one going in, them detaining private citizens that are going to try and private individuals that are going in to try and save their own kids, to bring their own firearms in. You can even set that aside, right?
Yeah.
There's no way that law enforcement gets to this mall in Indiana fast enough to stop this shooting as fast as this armed individual did, as this private person did. And that's exactly how we can better protect our neighborhoods, how we could better protect our people, and how we could better protect our communities. Here's an interesting element of this, and you guys might have opinions or views and topics on this. The mall in question actually is private property and actually has a no carry policy. So one of the things that has come out after is the gun control movement is trying to lambast this 22-year-old who stopped this would-be mass shooter as, being lawless and violating the company's policy and carrying against their, stated interest or their stated goal in keeping firearms off the property. And to me, that's just, it's a lot of things, but it's beyond disgusting. This idea that you're going to stand up and say, oh, he shouldn't have been carrying there, and more people would have died. That would have been the only result if he would not have been carrying.
Well, there's a couple of facets to that. One, I want to make sure that our listeners understand 3 people died other than the shooter. And so, for those families, for the friends and loved ones of those 3, I'm sure this is devastating. This is horrific. It's terrible. And at the same time, this is just a hard truth. And at the same time, 3 is better than 13 or 30 or 50 or some much bigger number. I mean, and I don't mean to be crass about this in any way. It's just the truth. Here's the other thing. So the mall has this policy. It failed. It failed because that lunatic brought a gun in blatant violation. So if the mall's not going to be able to enforce this, now it's private property. If actually, unlike government buildings, if a privately owned building wants to put up a metal detector or something like that, hey, it's theirs. Now, a lot of people might say, I don't want to go shopping there. Right? That's the cost of freedom. The same thing with your house. You throw a dinner party. Hey, if you want to have a little metal detector inside your door and say you're welcome to come in if you've been invited, but you got to come through the metal detector first. That's up to you. That's your house. That's your property. You're free to do that. Some people might say that's kind of weird, so I'm not going to go. And people make their own choices. But you're absolutely right that what this guy did. In fact, I want to suggest to our listeners that they adopt a different language about this. I know that phrase "Good Samaritan" is circulating, and it's often used in these. That story of the Samaritan. The Samaritans were a group of people in biblical times, and this comes from a story in the New Testament. And the Good Samaritan, there's an important difference about the Good Samaritan story. In that story, a man is beaten and robbed, and he's injured, and people are passing him by. They're just ignoring him. And the Good Samaritan is the Samaritan who stops and offers help, offers aid, right, and comfort and food. He doesn't show up and take out the bad guys. I think this is something much more than a Good Samaritan. This is more than just offering some aid to someone who's in distress. This is feisty, spirited citizenship. This is that civic virtue we talk about in the Vino and Veritas Society of self-assertion, saying, no, I'm not just going to sit back and watch someone violate the rights of others and maybe violate my rights. No, I'm not going to. I'm going to assert myself and stand up and take out this murderer. That's really what this is.
Tom, that's a really big point, and I don't want to take away from it. I do want to revisit real quickly the comment you both made about this is private property and therefore they should be allowed to do whatever they want. And everybody who's been listening to this for a while knows I generally agree with that statement. What I would challenge in this case in particular is, did that private property take government funding to get built? It's a mall. I would guarantee you
that's a good point.
Almost certainly they got tax incentives. They got grants. They got different programs from the governments in the area to help fund it. And all of a sudden it stops being a private business.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I want to just really, I know that we're wrapping up soon, that I really want to touch on is that something that, Tom, you said as you kind of kicked off and Dave, that you're alluding to here, though, is this mall had a no carry policy, right? Here's what we know about public shooters. The vast majority of them target gun-free zones.
Yes.
This guy probably, and I don't know that anything has come out factually about this yet, but this dude who went in to try and shoot up this mall probably knew that the mall had a no gun policy. And he probably expected that nobody would be carrying there. And this 22-year-old, I think his name just came out. His name is Elijah Dickin. He violated the mall's policy. And there are an untold number of people that are alive because he violated that mall's policy. Those gun-free zones don't work, right? Tom, you said it didn't work. They weren't able to enforce it. There's nothing that they can do to enforce it. What you do is you empower people to be able to carry. And that's another kind of terminology thing that I think is really important is a lot of times we talk about law-abiding citizens or law-abiding individuals. Maybe it's important to ensure that, and so the way that I always talk about it is peaceable individuals, people who are doing their best to, embody their rights, to be able to be empowered to exercise their rights and are not hurting anybody in doing that. Because sometimes there are unjust laws, and that changes the framework of what do we really want to be highlighting about people. And for me, I try and highlight that, these are peaceable individuals, people who are exercising their rights and are not hurting anybody else when they do so.
Cody, your point is so important. I just want to restate it and amplify it. When law-abiding, peaceful people who are not looking to violate anyone else's rights, when they obey gun-free zones, those gun-free zones become really dangerous places. Those gun-free zones become less dangerous, far less dangerous, when law-obeying, peaceful citizens violate. I'm glad that young man, that 22-year-old man who took down the shooter, he did violate the mall's policies. I don't think there's any dispute about that. He violated. I'm so thankful that he violated that policy. By violating the policy, he made that mall a safer place. He made that a safer place for those citizens. Huge, important lesson. The nihilistic killer up in New York here, not too long ago, a couple months ago, he wrote about that. He very purposefully stayed in New York precisely because of these gun policies that we've been talking about that New York had. He knew when he went in, was it a grocery store, I think, where he went? He knew that it would be very unlikely to meet any kind of armed resistance. And he was right.
And Tom, to that point, everybody immediately jumps back to the gun control debate. And we have obviously talked about that a lot today too. But we still have to go back and ask, why are these things continuing to happen? It's partially because they know they're not going to face resistance. And part of it is we live in a world today where we're more progressive than ever before. I mean, Tom, this is your point. Yeah. We're more progressive than ever before. And yet at the same time, we have many, many more people who are angry and feeling slighted and wanting to go take out people in very harmful ways.
The truth is, when you look at this phenomenon of in the realm of criminal justice, research and studies, there's a very discrete category of random public mass murders. So these are not murders where like murders out of revenge or for personal slights. These are people who go and they want to kill strangers, people they don't know, as many as they can. That has been around. That's not a new thing. It's been around for a long time. Even in American history, you can reach back 150 years and find episodes. Here's the difference. They used to happen once every decade or two. Like they were rare. Some lunatic a century ago set off bombs in a Michigan school, blew up a bunch of I think that still might be the greatest mass murder in American history. These things have happened. There have always been deranged lunatics, but they were rare. What's strange about our world today is these events are just incredibly common. If you grow up as a kid today, you grow up hearing about these random mass murders of strangers. And the most important question we can ask is, why? Why do so many people in America today, we have more regulations than ever, we have more subsidies than ever, we learn what pronouns to use in grade school so that we don't offend anyone. So no one should be offended, no one should be angry, everyone should be safe and subsidized and fat and happy. And yet there are growing numbers of citizens who are purposeless. They seem to have no meaning in their life. They become nihilistic killers, and they go out and look to just destroy and slaughter as many as they can before they get taken down. That is the real challenge for anybody who really cares about what's most important in life.
Guys, this was a great conversation. I think we got into some depth that we don't normally get a chance to do. Cody, thank you so much for joining us today and doing that. Just a reminder to everybody again, July 28th, Franklin, Tennessee, just south of Nashville. All three of us will be there. Love to see you there. Come visit, come send your friends, and we will have a wonderful night at the Factory of Franklin with Dr. Ben Carson.
Dave will be in the back of the room eating avocado tacos.
I'll go fried avocado tacos.
That's right. Fried. The frying, I'm assuming, makes a big difference.
Oh, tempura battered avocados are a revelation to me.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it, and we'll see you in just over a week.
Look forward to it.
Nos
See you soon,
somos
guys.
custodes.